Welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode 66, live calls, chat room, Audacity plugins, podcast cards, and more in feedback. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. You can follow me on Twitter at The Ramen Noodle. And I'm happy that you are listening to this episode because this is a chance that you're going to get some of your questions directly answered. I've received feedback, lots of feedback. Some of it I tend to just answer directly and reply back with, oh, check out this or that or whatever. But also some of it I save for the show. And I've had so many things going on with topics I wanted to share and address in certain times for the show that I've forgotten to look at my feedback folder, which has been getting very full. So I'm spending some time to address and answer much of this feedback that's been coming in, because I especially want my inbox to reach zero as close as possible to zero. So the feedback that I'm going to share is from several people. And as you're going to see, several people have called in and emailed in with the same question. First of all, I have a feedback from Fred Casteneda. Fred is from Texas, and he meant to try and come to PodCamp Cincinnati, but wasn't able to. However, he sent in this feedback related to episode 54 when I talked about the 9 tips for growing your audience by attending social media events.
Hey, Daniel J. Lewis. This is Fred Casteneda speaking from Austin, Texas, from my podcast, Struggling Entrepreneur at www.strugglingentrepreneurs. I'm listening to Audacity to Podcast, episode 54, and you had tip number 7, which was to have podcast-specific business cards. I actually have 6 or 8 since 2006. I've been shall we say, I have adhered to that, and I've been a promoter and a supporter of getting a business card specifically for your podcast to target your audience and show them that you have expertise or that you're a thought leader or that you have passion for this particular type of subject or area or type of content that you're producing, whether it's fee or free. And I agree with what you said there. You should be a giver, not a taker, and podcasts have always been that way. I've spoken at 6 of them. Anyway, take care and hope to see you at the next PodCamp Cincy. I'm putting it on my calendar for next year. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Fred, for calling in that feedback and for being a supporter of PodCamp Cincinnati. By the way, if you guys are interested in that, Cincinnati social media conference, you can check it out at podcampcincinnati.com. We don't have a date yet for this year, but probably sometime in late October is when we'll be doing that. So Fred had mentioned that he sent me actually some of his podcast cards, and they're business cards, but for his podcast, and he's had great success with them, and he sent me a bunch of them. And I have looked all over for these things because I wanted to show them to you guys in the show notes over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/66. I just cannot find them anywhere. So I've emailed Fred and asked him to send me a picture if he could. So check back on the show notes and check back frequently if you want to see some examples of Fred's cards. And I'll get a photo from him of some of his cards there. And yeah, business cards for your podcast are a great way that you can spread the word and great way that you can promote your podcast instead of just a single card that says you're a podcaster. Having multiple cards for each of your podcasts works great because you're talking to someone, and like for me, for example, I might be talking to someone and they say, I'm interested in learning how to podcast. Then I would say, oh, hey, here's a podcast I have that you should listen to. And the card is exactly what they need. So they take it home, they look it up. Instead of just, if I give them a card that says Daniel Lewis, podcaster, check out noodle.mx, then it's not as relevant to them. Same thing with other podcasts. And I'm working on redesigning my own podcast cards in order to better market myself in that way. But podcast cards are a great thing, and it's good to hear that Fred has had such great success with them for 5 years. That's great. Now comes an email in from Scott, or he sometimes is in the chat room as Stud. He says, "Hi, Daniel. I listened to your episode on reasons to do live podcasts." Now, that was a series of episodes back in 2010, summer of 2011, where I talked about how to live stream your podcast and all of this live podcasting, which we kind of call it live streaming more specifically. And I'll have a link to that and all of those episodes in the show notes at theaudacitypodcast.com/66. So he says, I do have this annual joint live podcast coming up, and I am in a hurry to get everything prepared. I've been looking around for the best way to do things, but I figured I could just ask you real quick, and you would probably have the answers. He has 3 questions here. Number 1, I would like to stream a Skype conversation to something embedded in my WordPress site. And I'll answer these one by one. So, embedding a live streaming Skype conversation on your WordPress site. I would recommend, if you're doing just audio, I would recommend the service called Mixlr. That's Mixlr. It's really easy to set up, works really well, and it's designed just for audio, and it's free. You can also upgrade to get certain things, like they record it on their side, and you can download the recordings later. They record it in higher quality and all of that if you pay for the version, but their free version is also really good. You can embed it on your site. You can even put it in a WordPress post or a page, and people can listen to your podcast on WordPress or on Facebook. That's what I was trying to say, Facebook, and listen to your podcast or embed the code on your WordPress site. It's at mixlr.com, Mixlr. And it works great for audio-only conversations. That's the service that you could use. But what I would recommend for streaming is, well, it can be kind of difficult depending on your computer setup. I'll tell you one way, but it might not work. The one way is you would need to be able to capture your microphone and your other co-host or someone through Skype and send that to Mixlr, Justin.tv, Ustream, whatever streaming service you're using. The hard thing is you've got 2 audio inputs there, and you can't just tell Windows or OS X to grab your stereo mix. That won't quite work, because stereo mix to your computer would be what you hear. Now, it could work if you enable the monitoring on your input, and that's in Windows, or you could create an aggregate device in OS X in order to combine these things into a single device and send that out. It's, especially on the Windows side, recording the stereo mix, or what you hear as it's sometimes called, very difficult to do. Microsoft has really locked that down to try and prevent people from copying music off the internet, streaming music. So try updating your drivers for your sound card, look for better drivers, or look around for stereo mix related to your sound card, because it's hit and miss, really. The other way that you could do it is with hardware, instead of just doing it with software, with hardware. 2 different ways that you could do this, which I will explain in a moment as I answer one of his other questions. So that was question number 1, how to stream it to something and embed it in his WordPress site. I recommend Mixlr. Question 2, I would like to have a chat like on noodle.mx/live, where people do not have to make an account to participate. Right now, I recommend Chatango. That's chatango.com. It's great because it allows anonymous chatters. It allows people to set a name but not register an account. Or people can register an account over at chatango.com and log in with that into their chat room. So like when I look at my chat room right now, I see when I do this live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern time, I see we've got Eileen is in there, Brad, and for Georgian, whom I never really know what their first name is. They're in there as live listeners to the show. And they're in the chat room. I see them by name in the chat room. They probably all have registered accounts. Occasionally I see anonymous people in there. Those are people who come in, participate in the chat, but don't create an account and don't set a nickname. And that's fine too. And it's great. The two disadvantages to Chatango. 1, it's powered by Flash. So that means it won't work on several mobile devices, like anything that's iOS made by Apple. And it's because it's Flash, it also just slows things down sometimes. I've had problems where while I have the chat room running in the same browser that's also running Ustream or something else that has Flash, I've had problems where it locks up completely, or I can't type. Like, it looks like I've got all of these typos, but I've pressed the button and nothing happened on a key. And then the other problem with it is if you're like me and you have a high resolution screen on a small screen, or you just have a small screen and you have a hard time seeing what people are saying, you cannot zoom in on Chatango. Some Flash-powered chat rooms you can zoom in on, like if you do a page zoom. Not Chatango. If you zoom in on Chatango, like everything except the actual chat messages zoom. So it's really defeating the purpose of the zoom, if that's the case. So there are other systems out there like Cbox and chatroll.com and several other systems, IRC. I may eventually be switching to an IRC-based chat room, which is Internet Relay Chat, I think is what that stands for. It's a bit geekier, but the great thing is it can work anywhere with almost anything. And I like that idea, so I may eventually switch to that. But if you want something easy, chatango.com, and it's free. You can embed it in your show and customize its options. It's great for that. And that's what I use right now as of January 2012, and I've used that for a while. His third question is, I would like for people in the audience to be able to call in to our Skype conversations. I will answer that in more detail in a moment, because I've got some other calls in from that. He says, suggestions, thank you very much for your help with everything. Scott/Stud. So going back to this issue of recording with Mixlr and two different ways that you could do it hardware-wise. Number one, you could use two computers, just like many people recommend for using Skype, where you have a second computer as your Skype computer, and you have a mixer, and you do mixer mix minus. Either of these cases, I really recommend you have a mixer. So if you have two computers, one is your Skype computer and the other is your main computer, or it could be your broadcast computer. So it's really easy then. You set up your Skype mix minus, which that just means that the people on Skype are plugged in to receive an output from your mixer that removes them from the mix. So that's why it's a mix minus. It's minus their audio so that they're not hearing themselves back. And you do that by using the auxiliary out of your mixer. And most mixers have that. Even the really little mixers have a way of doing that. So it's very easy to do. So you set that up with the second computer. And then the main outputs that capture both your voice and your Skype voice goes into your broadcasting computer that broadcasts to Skype. The other way of doing it is use one computer with two inputs, because this comes back to the reason we need a mix minus is so that the person on Skype does not hear themselves back. So to do this with one computer, you need two separate inputs. You could use a USB device input for one and an analog input device for the other. You do the exact same Skype mix minus setup, but you make one of those outputs the minus the Skype person's output go back to Skype so they don't hear themselves. And then you make the main output go into your second input on the computer. And that then goes out to the live show. More information about this will be linked to from the show notes at theaudacitypodcast.com/66, because I did some graphs and illustrations a while back. I can't quite remember what episode number it was, but I'll have to link in the show notes. It was to when I talked about how to live stream, and I was doing this long series on how to live stream your episodes. So I have some diagrams that show ways you could do this, some cheaper ways, but get kind of complicated and the quality might not be there as much as you want. For a small, inexpensive mixer, there are two that I'd recommend. I really do recommend that you have a mixer if you want to do anything other than just a solo podcast. Really inexpensive mixers. The Behringer 302 USB mixer. This is, just like its name indicates, it's a USB mixer. It's designed for USB input and output. It has just a single XLR. It's really small, really handy. I don't think it even needs a power cable. I think it's just USB powered. It's $50 from Amazon.com, and I have a link to that in the show notes where you can purchase through my Amazon affiliate. And then there's the Behringer Xenix 502, which is $40. Now that doesn't have USB, but it does have just a couple more input methods than the 302, but it still only has one XLR. They're just slightly different between the two and different prices, so you could determine there which you like best for your setup and budget. But I do really recommend that you get a mixer if you want to do something like that. Now let's talk about taking live calls. Wayne Henderson and Stephen Greenwood from separate websites both called in some questions, and I want to give them both credit on this. So let's play their voicemail.
Daniel, hi, this is Wayne Henderson from MediaVoiceovers.com calling in for your Audacity to podcast. And first off, I want to give you props because the last 4 or 5 episodes have been gold. In fact, the last 2 episodes of the Audacity to podcast are definite keepers. I guess that would make them platinum even more valuable than gold.
By the way, he's talking about the live streaming series from 2011. Yes, this is old feedback. That's why it's dated like that in a sense. But he's talking about some older episodes about live streaming your podcast.
Hi, just some great suggestions and tips. I'd love to hear you talk about the different ways that I could possibly take live calls on my podcasts. Thanks for everything.
Thank you very much, Wayne, from MediaVoiceovers.com. And Stephen Greenwood also asked the same question or a similar question.
Hi, Daniel. My name is Stephen Greenwood, and I work for a company called SB Nation at sbnation.com. We are a network of sports blogs, and we're kind of getting into our first foray into the world of podcasting. One of our issues is that we're looking to feature live callers into one of our podcasts, and I wanted to see if you had ever experimented with that or knew of any solutions of getting like live calls and how to handle multiple phone lines, and if there's kind of a software, a good piece of software that would handle all of that. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for calling that in. And remember that the message I received also from Scott/Stud. He asked a very similar question. How could he get people to call into his, now he was saying Skype conversation. There are many, many ways of doing this, and I'm going to have a full episode talking just about this topic. But I wanted to try and address this before then because I've been meaning to cover this for a while and I haven't, and so I just decided better cover it overview way here in this episode. So there are multiple ways that you could get people to send in live feedback. You could do, it really comes down to just 2, Skype or a phone call. The easiest one is a phone call because someone can just pick up the phone, dial your number, and they're connected. Skype gives you much better quality, but depending on your Skype privacy settings and how you have stuff set up, they might have to add you as a friend, you approve it, then they call you. They might not know that they can just outright call you on Skype without adding you as a friend. It gets a little tricky. And I will actually be doing this very soon because the Ramen Noodle Clean Comedy Podcast is about to have its 100th episode. We're planning for that to be on February 22nd, Wednesday evening, recording our 100th episode. And for that 100th episode, I'm planning to have people call in live and tell funny stories with us and just have a lot of fun. It won't be like a mass conference call, but it will be people can call in and share a funny story or tell us a joke or something. It will be interesting too, because I hope everything that is called in will actually be funny. But I'll be doing the same thing, and I plan to do this also for my Once Upon a Time podcast over at oncepodcast.com, where people can call in while we're recording and share their theories, and we can talk about their theories. And I love the idea of incorporating the community that much more into the podcast. So how can you do this? Let's let's take the example of a phone number because we're just going to look at this from a couple simple ways. Take a phone number. It's the easiest way for people to call in. Set up, again, a mixer. I really recommend you have a mixer for this. That's the best way to do this. Set up a mixer for Skype Mix Minus. Again, I'll have links for that in the show note over at theaudacitypodcast.com/66. Create a Google Voice number, and you can get that over at voice.google.com. If you don't already have one, you might already have one. Then go into your Google Voice settings. So you can click on the gear in the little upper right corner. There's a button there, and it opens to the Phones tab. Two options that you have here that you could set. One, you could have it forward to your own cell phone and connect that to your mixer, or you could have it forward to Gmail as long as you're logged into Google Talk through Gmail. This is a great way to do this. And in fact, I use my professional Google Voice number, which used to be the feedback number for the podcast, but I use that to make all business calls. And I often do that through Gmail, or I receive calls through Gmail. Sometimes I have it forward just straight to my phone, or I'll answer it on my phone, or I'll answer it on Gmail. But what this does is it allows you very easily to take a live call, connect it through your computer, send it into your mixer, and then out to your recorder or your computer that's recording. I do recommend that you have two computers for this. If you don't, then you can do the same thing like I mentioned before, one computer with multiple inputs, because treat the phone call the exact same way that you would treat a Skype call. But the difference is it's an open-ended thing. You're telling people this is the number to call, connect, and you'll be able to join the conversation with us. Just make sure you're logged into Google and the Gmail account for that Google Voice number, and you're logged into Gtalk, which will be a little widget on the side, and test this yourself. Do not launch a live podcast without testing this yourself. Make sure that you can call out, make sure that people can call in, make sure that you can hear, they can hear, all of that stuff. There are other ways that you could do this other than TalkShoe, or other than Google Voice, and that is TalkShoe or Blog Talk Radio. Now, I recommend those just for using the incoming call. Don't use those services for your actual podcast because they're telephone quality, and telephone quality is terrible for a podcast. I have stopped listening to podcasts that I wanted to listen to just because it's telephone quality. I cannot stand a telephone quality podcast. I get a little passionate there. But you can use these services for incoming calls. TalkShoe or Blog Talk Radio. TalkShoe is free, and I've used this when doing PodCamp Cincinnati planning calls, so it works great for that. You could also forward your feedback number, like I said, your Google Voice or some other number that you have, to your phone and connect your phone to your mixer with an iPod AV cable. Now, it's a specific one. It looks like, on one end, it looks like a stereo 1/8 inch or 3.5 millimeter plug, but instead of just the 3 rings, it has 4 rings or 3 black stripes on it. This, and then the other end of it has the red and white and yellow RCA cables like you'd see on the older TVs or VCRs or DVD players. Generally, the sound from the phone goes in through the red and white cables, and generally the microphone back to the phone, your voice, goes through the yellow cable. And this works with almost any phone that has a regular headphone size jack. Even if you have a phone that has a smaller jack, you might be able to get an adapter and it would still work for you. But it works really well. And these cables are under $1. Now, you have shipping too, but under $1 for this cable to be able to accept live phone calls. Plug it into your mixer. It works fantastic. I really like that. I'll have a link to that in the show notes at theaudacitypodcast.com/66. Pick up one of these cables. In fact, it's $1, under $1. I think it's like 39 cents. It costs more to mail a letter than to get this cable. So pick one up and you can accept phone calls then through your phone and then make another service forward to your phone. Again, I really recommend having a mixer for these things. It makes it a lot easier. More details and links to relevant stuff are in the show notes at theaudacitypodcast.com/66. Then Ron Eastwood sent in an email about managing Audacity plugins. And this is some great ideas here in his email. He wrote in 2 different emails. First, wondering if I tried this and if I had any thoughts on it. And then he sent me his progress. He says, "Hi, Daniel. My question is about all the plugins in Audacity. I read through some of the team notes." He's talking about the developers' notes. "And it seems there are ways, and it seems they are a ways off from dividing them into subsets like Adobe Audition does, for example." That would be when you look at the plugins list and maybe you have a lot, maybe you have a few, but dividing those up into sub things. Photoshop does this. A lot of programs do this with their plugins, filters, and effects, where they're sub-menus. I wondered if you have given much thought to that and how you manage the sheer volume of plugin effects. There are only a few that I really use: amplify, noise removal, normalize to start. I would like a few equalizer options as well as some reverb, and Chris's dynamic compressor, of course, which, by the way, I'm back to using that. I didn't like Levelator. For now, kind of ish. I was thinking of creating a folder named plugins not in use. Then I could drag all the other plugins into that folder. I would have them available if I ever wanted them, but it would clean up my Audacity interface immensely. Now, that is a great idea. Simply move the plugins out of the Audacity plugins folder into another folder, or create a subfolder and move the ones you're not using into there. And he said, "I've been experimenting with this and it has not crashed Audacity." So that's good news. I had downloaded the LAPSDA plugins. You can get those from the Audacity website at audacity.sourceforge.net. So my list was over 100 items. I found a listing online by the guy who made most of the lapsdas, and that helped me to see what ones might be useful for me. I weeded out the others. Now I will have to play around and whittle my list down some more. I would ideally like the list of effects to all be visible on the screen without scrolling. That's from Ron Eastwood. That is a fantastic idea, that if you have too many plugins in your Audacity menu, then just move some of them from the Audacity plugins folder and keep them in a separate folder. That way, if you ever need them again, you can go back to them. And if you don't want them, then you leave them there. Just keep in mind that if you update Audacity, it will put those plugins right back into that folder again, so you have to move them out. And if you use OS X, then you'll notice that Audacity has some extra plugins. They're all Apple-based plugins that come pre-installed with OS X. You can't move those around in that Audacity effects menu. So it's better than having 100 items in there. You can whittle it down to maybe 25, and the first 3 of those are the ones that are relevant to you. So thank you, Ron Eastwood, for sending in that feedback. Then lastly of the feedback that I want to answer here is Christopher wrote in saying, "Hi, I am a podcaster and I use a program called Virtual Audio Cable for $30. This is, by the way, in response to when I talk about an aggregate device on OS X, which is where you can use software to combine multiple devices, like multiple USB inputs or multiple inputs, whatever, into a single device, and you select that and record from that. It's kind of like all of these devices funneling into one device that then gets recorded. So he's talking about for Windows. It's called Virtual Audio Cable. It's $30. He says, it has a bit of a learning curve, but allows you to make multiple audio cables, virtual cables that is, and tell various sources of sound, including outputs, to route through those cables. You can then use Audacity to take one of those cables as an input. It is kind of hard to explain. There are some YouTube videos about it, Christopher. Thank you very much, Christopher. This is great because I often talk about certain things in OS X that unfortunately aren't available in Windows. Now, it is unfortunate that this costs $30, but it does provide a great alternative to the people who want to be able to make an aggregate device. So combining multiple devices, like multiple USB mics, or a USB mic and an analog, or a USB and your system sounds and something else, or whatever. Combining these multiple devices, and this is a way that you can do it on Windows. I'll have a link to this in the show notes at theaudacitypodcast.com/66. And you can check that out. It's $30, not an affiliate link. He did say that it has this learning curve, and he's using just the free version, just playing with it. But the free version has some limitations, and it apparently has a female voice that comes in every few seconds and gives a little like watermark basically to your audio. But check it out, see what you think, and if you like it, buy it for $30. It might be worth it for you. So that's the feedback that I'm going to share for now from our listeners. Thank you very much, Fred, Wayne, Stephen, Scott, Ron, and Christopher for sending in that great feedback. And I will have this stuff and the links mentioned in the show notes at theaudacitypodcast.com/66. So you can check this out and check out their websites too. I have the links to each of them in the show notes there too. Now, a couple things I want to share with you audio-wise that are interesting things. Like I mentioned just in passing, last episode 65, I did that whole compressor showdown. And I heard back from Jim Kerwin, because remember how I started playing with Jim Kerwin's sound and then I stopped because I said, this sounds like it's already compressed. The compressors aren't doing much to it. There was a point that I missed in his description of the sound, or maybe it was that he didn't mention it to me. He is using a hardware compressor limiter gate. He's using the MDX 4600, which is the same device I use from Behringer. And so that's why his audio was already compressed looking and sounding and wasn't getting compressed much more. I frequently play with my compressor settings, trying to find just that optimal spot. I've even been playing with them while I've been recording. So in case you hear little breath sounds where it cuts off my breath or something, I've been playing with that while I've been recording this today. But that's why his audio was not as good of an example for the different compressor plugins, because his audio was already compressed through hardware, which is great. I like having the hardware and the advantages it adds, and I still run it through software. But just like he said too, he also still runs it through Chris's dynamic compressor, which goes through and makes things sound even better. Now, my thoughts as I've been trying this, and I've been using Levelator, trying to give it a second chance. And remember how I talked about Levelator's good things that it did were it did not amplify noise that was already there. It did a nice job of keeping the noise down or amplifying just the parts that were important. It didn't completely remove the noise when there wasn't any audio, but it certainly didn't do that like other plugins do, Chris's dynamic compressor being one of them. However, the workflow of using Levelator was getting very annoying to me. I tried it on multiple things as I've been editing audio for PodCamp Cincinnati. It made extra files to manage, and these extra files were the same size as the original file, so that meant I was doubling my storage space. Then I'd bring it into Audacity and sometimes do further edits there, which might double my space again. It was a pain. Levelator is very slow. It is much slower than Chris's dynamic compressor. And so that was getting bothersome of having to wait for it to process these files. Levelator is very convenient, and I wouldn't say it's completely useless. It depends a lot on the audio that you put into it. Like I showed in those demos, if your audio has a lot of noise and you don't have a noise gate that turns on and off your audio inputs, when you're not talking. If you don't have one of those, and you do have a constant noise in the background between your words, the Levelator does a great job. It's super easy to use, no settings to worry about, all of that. But in my case, I've found that it just doesn't work for me. It's too slow. It creates these extra files that are a pain to manage. And I was finding that for me, for my audio, it wasn't amplifying it enough consistently, or some of the quieter spots consistently, and I couldn't tweak it at all. And since I use a noise gate, so the gate closes whenever I'm not talking and no sound is allowed through, I'm not as concerned about noise in the background, getting that ramping up and down sound, that little humps in your audio. I'm not as concerned about that. So I'm actually going back to using Chris's dynamic compressor for my audio, because I get high quality audio, very little noise in the background, and I have a noise gate already. What works for you might be different. I'm still playing with settings again as I reevaluate this and trying to change like the noise floor or how much noise removal or the noise gate fall off that I do. It's interesting there, but I am back to using Chris's dynamic compressor after trying Levelator and being disappointed with it. And then the other thing that is maybe a crazy issue, well, two kind of crazy issues that are bugging me with some of my podcasting workflows. I just got a Behringer HA400, which is a headphone splitter and amplifier. So that way my co-hosts have their own volume controls. It's cool, but it's weird. It gives me headaches. If you're here watching the live show on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time over at noodle.mx/live, you might see me, or maybe you're even hearing me frequently pop my ears, like where I do like a fake yawn or something, like open my mouth, do that kind of pop, because something about these headphone splitters, or maybe it's just a problem with this particular one, and I've talked to Behringer about it and they've suggested exchanging it. Something about it is amplifying just the bass from my voice. So what I'm saying sounds like someone ran multi-band compressor with the bass way too high, and I'm hearing just the bass amplified in my ears, and it's giving me a headache. It really is. I have a headache after I do a podcast episode because of the thing that happens with the amplifier. And it does it only to my voice. It's really weird. And it seems to be just the audio that comes through the Heil PR40s, but not the audio that comes through my cheap microphones or the audio that comes in from the computer. So it's really weird that it does that, and it's giving me headaches, and it makes my ears actually pop up because of the way it does it. For you, how this applies to you is don't run a multi-band compressor and over-amplify the bass, because you'll get headaches for people, and people's ears will pop like mine continually are. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, oddity that's going on, just sharing with you some podcasting stuff, is you may have noticed over at the audacitytopodcast.com, I've been switching the commenting systems around, and I've blogged a couple times about, initially I said why I'm leaving intense debate, and then I blogged about why I can't use Livefire. Next, I'm going to blog about why I can't use Discuss either. What it comes down to for me is because I have a WordPress network, which is a single WordPress installation that runs multiple sites, the Audacity to Podcast, cleancomedypodcast.com, oncepodcast.com, noodle.mx, podcampcincinnati.com, and several other WordPress sites that I run within my own network, christianmeetsworld.com, areyoujustwatching.com, and more, are all run from a single WordPress installation. It's called WordPress Network. It used to be called WordPress Multi-User, then it was called WordPress Multi-Site, now it's called WordPress Network. Discuss and Livefire are not compatible with WordPress Network. Discuss thinks they are, but we can't get this problem figured out. And Livefire outright knows that they aren't, but they don't mention that on the plugin page. So if you're running a WordPress network, do not use Livefire. The problem that comes up is initially one problem, but I think another problem might be related to. The first problem is that the comments that people leave in these systems are supposed to synchronize back to my WordPress installation and save themselves in my database. So that way I could switch to a different commenting plugin and never use any comments. Not the case. Both Discuss and Livefire are not synchronizing the comments back to the Audacity podcast. So if you go over to the Audacity podcast and you look at some of the past episodes, you may notice that a comment that you left isn't there anymore. And it's not because I removed it. I don't remove comments. I don't require moderation on comments. You post a comment and it shows up there immediately. Please don't abuse that freedom. But the problem was that I switched initially from Intense Debate to Livefire, and then from Livefire to Discuss. So those comments that were left while I was using Livefire didn't go back into the database. So when I switched to Discuss, those comments weren't there to go into Discuss. Now that I'm on Discuss, the comments that are being made in Discuss aren't going back to WordPress either. So even if I go back to Intense Debate at this point, I'm going to lose all of the comments from the last month or so. Now, they won't be lost permanently. They'll stay in Intense Debates or stay in Discuss's system as well as staying in Livefire systems. I just can't get them back onto my website. The same thing is happening over at oncepodcast.com. I launched it with the Livefire commenting system. And over there, every single comment on the site, with the exception of one, was made after I installed Livefire. And all of those comments are in Livefire's system. They are not in my system. They're not synchronized back to my database. Most of this is related to the fact that it's a WordPress network. Definitely with Livefire, and we think so with Discuss. The other problem I'm having with Livefire is that Facebook comments are not synchronizing back to the posts. That could just be I have something configured incorrectly, or it could be the WordPress networks. But I just wanted to share that with you. Discuss and Livefire are awesome commenting plugins. And if you run a single site WordPress installation, then you could consider both of those. They both have their pluses and minuses and such. I like Discuss better between Livefire and Discuss. I like certain things about Discuss better and like certain things about Livefire better. But if either of them were working without this bug, I would be using Discuss. But if Livefire had a couple little things tweaked, I'd be using Livefire. So check out my blog posts over at theaudacitypodcast.com/ well, I'll have a link to the show notes. I'll have a link in the show notes over at theaudacitypodcast.com/66. By the way, the whole headphone thing, that's why I keep stumbling over my words, is it's just giving me this headache as I'm talking, and it's making me stumble over my own words a lot more in this episode and last episode than I usually do. So I'm sorry about that. I'm hoping to get this fixed very soon. One last thing I want to ask you. I want to get your feedback on a future episode I'm planning to do. And this topic will be the things to get right when you first launch your podcast that you can't fix quite as easily later. That won't be the actual title. But I want to know from you, what are those first mistakes, the things that you wish you could have done differently when you first started that you can't fix now? Yeah, certainly, we all have things we wish we did differently when we first started. I'm talking about the things that we have to get right in the beginning. Certain stuff like just how you do your podcast, not necessarily something that you can't change later. Like when I look at oncepodcast.com, the way we first started the episodes, when we were doing the content and going through an episode about the TV show, it was very disjointed, but we've found a pattern now and we're doing it much better now than we did before. See, we can fix that along the way. An example of something you can't fix along the way is what if you started on a service like Podbean or Podango or one of those services that's free but doesn't give you control over your own RSS feed? Then what do you do? See, that's one of those things where if you start it wrong, then you're going to be in a pickle later and you're going to hate it. So what are some things that you can think of that are crucial to doing right the first time? Like, this is the most important thing to do right when you first start that you can't fix later on. Another example, splitting your MP3 or your podcast episode feed from your regular site feed. That's another example. There is a way to work around that, but it's kind of complicated. And several other things. So I would love to hear from you, your feedback on those things. You can send that to feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com or call into 903-231-2221. And you can leave a comment on the show notes and discuss this episode over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/66. And I would like to hear from you. What other stuff do you think I should be talking about? I do have still a list of many topics to discuss on the Audacity to Podcast, but I'm still open to things that you think I should address as how-to information and more. I'm recording this episode on the 30th of January, so after the 31st, the price for podcast cover art will be going up, and even if the new price is affordable to you, you might want to wait just a little bit because I am booked solid on web design and other projects, which is just great. I'm so happy about that. To be able to pay my bills is wonderful. But you can check out anything there if you're interested in it over at podcastcoverart.com. So be sure that you check out the show notes. Follow me on twitter.com/theramennoodle. And get the show notes at theaudacitytopodcast.com/66. By the way, I want to remind you that the Audacity to Podcast is a member of the Tech Podcast Network. And there are so many awesome podcasts over there at the Tech Podcast Network on all kinds of technology. And guess what? They are all family-friendly episodes too. No profanity, no explicit content. It's just all great stuff. So check it out over at techpodcasts.com. It's a great group of people over there. Check out the podcast for this show over at theaudacitytopodcast.com. Please make sure you're subscribed, leave comments, ratings in iTunes and all of that. Sign up for the email newsletter if you want. And follow me on twitter.com/theramennoodle. Feedback at theaudacitytopodcast.com or 903-231-2221. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go podcast with passion, organization, and dialogue. Thank you so much for listening. The Audacity to Podcast is a proud member of the Noodle Mix Network. Find more of our podcasts like Clean Comedy or Christian movie reviews with critical thinking or our new podcast about the Once Upon a Time TV show over at noodle.mx. That's the Noodle Mix Network at noodle.mx. You can also check out the Tech Podcast Network, which I highly recommend because if it's tech, it's here over at techpodcasts.com.